Thank you very much for joining us. That was incredibly inspiring.
Oh, great.
And, you know, one thing Jeff said was that the way we treat children today is a disgrace. I think there's broad agreement about this. Now, you have been involved in child advocacy, you noted, since 1969, since I was a child. And so I want to ask about lessons learned over those years so that we, at this conference, when we go home, we can be more effective. And, you know, why is it that we know what to do, we have the resources, and yet the way children live today in America is a disgrace?
Well, Nick, I think there are a number of reasons to that dilemma that we face. We know what to do, we know what children need for healthy development, and we don't consider every child our child, and we don't do what needs to be done. I used to say it's because children don't vote. They don't take lobbyists out for drinks. They don't have political power in and of themselves. They are totally dependent upon the rest of us to speak for them, to stand for them, as Jeff was just saying. And I think it is very difficult to make children's needs, children's welfare and well-being a voting issue over a sustained period of time. And it is something that Marion, worked on her entire life. Jeff has. I've, tried to do what I could as well to try to make sure that anybody holding office, running for office, making policy in our country understands they will be held accountable for what they do or don't do to children. But what that really translates is whether or not they support families in the important work of raising children, because you have to support families in order to maximize the positive outcomes for kids. And we do that very, sporadically. During COVID, we came up with, financial help for families to be able to survive COVID, for small businesses not to collapse, for employers to keep people employed. We had the, child tax credit to keep families afloat. So when the crisis hit, we understood what we had to do, and we did it. And then, of course, like so much else, the effects of that were positive, but it is now, unfortunately, ending. And so we're back trying to figure out how we're going to do this. And I just want to end by saying, we are now having debates in our Congress and in states as to whether we're going to provide free lunch to kids in school, something that I thought was resolved decades ago. We're having a debate, which I hope comes out the right way, as to whether we can try to reinstate some or all of the child tax credit. So I guess the final point that I would make is, as Jeff was saying, you just can never rest. You can't ever assume that providing the supports family needs in order to care for children is as protected as Social Security for the elderly. We've never committed ourselves to doing what is necessary to commit our resources to kids and families, and so we have to keep fighting. We can't ever stop, the effort to make that happen.
So you mentioned the refundable child tax credit, and advocates have been making the point that if we introduced it, we could bring child poverty down by half, and then it worked, and then we fumbled. It slipped through our fingers, and you make the point that benefits for the elderly have sticking power, and those for children don't seem to. Are there ways that we can help create that sticking power politically?
There are, but we have to overcome some, what I view as kind of underlying sort of psychological stigma that is used to prevent support for all families. And by that I mean, if families demanded the kind of support they need to do the best job they can in raising their children, and they made it a voting issue, people running for and holding office would pay attention. But the messages that families get is, you know, you should be able to handle this on your own. It doesn't matter what, you know, is happening in the economy. It doesn't matter what individual struggles you might have with your health or losing your job or whatever might be going on. You need to handle that by yourself. And so people feel somewhat embarrassed to demand that they need more help raising children. And that has been used by political forces that don't want to give the help. And it's that kind of almost psychological barrier that we have to break through. You know, when Social Security was passed, and, you know, it's the third rail of American politics, and people who keep talking about cutting it back or undermining it often pay the price at the ballot box. There was a recognition that, you know, you've worked your whole life and you deserve to have some support as you age. Well, but we also need to look at the other end, the beginning, actually, of life and say, yeah, but kids need the best possible start, too. We all have a stake in that. We want people to be educated. We want them to be productive in the economy. We want them to be good citizens. So why aren't we investing in those outcomes? Well, because, you know, you have to be a rugged individual, and you have to take on all the responsibility of raising children by yourself. And if you ask for help, there's something weak about you, and we're not going to, you know, tolerate that. So I think a lot of people don't ask for the help they need because they don't want to be viewed as, you know, presenting a weakness that will be exploited against them.
Frankly, I've been sometimes disappointed by the practical effectiveness of some of the moral arguments, and I've heard you often make national security arguments for causes that you clearly care about for moral reasons. And indeed, in the case of investment in children, one could argue that one of the most effective arguments that has been made was Sputnik in 1957 and led to an investment in education. Is there a way, just as a tactical matter, that we should be making the argument that if we want to compete with China, for example, that is not just about new aircraft carriers and frigates, that it's about actually investing in kids?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I am old enough to remember my, I think it was fifth grade teacher after Sputnik walking into the classroom and saying, President Eisenhower wants you to learn math and science. Well, I thought that was pretty dramatic. And I thought, well, if the president wants me to learn, I'd better start learning. And then we had, you know, the presidential fitness. President Eisenhower wants you to run around the gym 5 times. And, you know, but that had a real impact. It was something that, you know, kids you know, in those days thought was very real, and that we were part of our country competing, in this case, against Russia. So think about this. Our all-volunteer military is having a very hard time recruiting acceptable candidates. People are either not applying, or when they apply, they're considered not meeting the standards. That's a national security issue, and why is that? You know, they're not healthy enough. They're not educated enough. Their mental health problems are interfering because they've never been in any way treated or even acknowledged. We also know if we don't have a strong economy, which really relies on people acquiring the skills that are needed in order to engage in economic activity, then we also are not competing. I mean, you can go down the list. If you look at where the United States is today, we are still the best positioned country in the world to take advantage of the benefits and opportunities of this century. And we seem to be talking ourselves down all the time. And we don't seem to be making the right investments in young people so that they can be part of what is important about seizing these opportunities. So I strongly feel like this is an economic security and a national security argument. And it's not just about some kids, it's about all kids. And I think this is part of where the political will begins to dissipate, because too many people in too many places don't see poor kids, black and brown kids, kids with disabilities, kids who, are in families that are dysfunctional and have all kinds of issues. They don't see them as part of the America that they want to champion. And so when you talk about, free school lunch, they picture somebody who's not like them. Picture somebody who comes from a family that should be, doing more to, lift themselves up by their bootstraps, even though, they have a parent who's, sick, or a parent who's incarcerated, or some other kind of challenge. So we have to do a much better job in saying that we are becoming, as California is, as Hawaii is, a, quote, majority-minority country. So by leaving certain kids out of the kind of hope for the future, by not investing in them, we are actually hurting ourselves, and we're hurting our economic and national security standing.
One thing that puzzles me is that other countries have figured this out. And in the period in which you have been a child advocate, Europe, Canada, Australia, so many other countries have figured out how to make these investments. They're politically accepted. Anybody who didn't support a universal child care system would be immediately voted out of office. And yet we haven't been able to muster that political will. I mean, why this element of American exceptionalism?
Well, I think because other countries actually look at facts and evidence when they make policy. So, the facts and evidence are really on our side about why investing in kids makes so much economic sense and everything else we've just been talking about. And there is this strain, I call it rugged individualism. You can call it, wrong-handed exceptionalism, or whatever you want to phrase it as, where our politics is so divided and divisive because people like to segment the electorate, and they segment, different aspects of society, and they pit us against each other. So if you're going to be helping children, well, what's that going to take away from who else? I mean, how do you have a consensus about what we need to do based on facts and evidence when your whole political future is premised on divisiveness and setting people against the poor, against people of different backgrounds, different colors, ethnicities, religions, whatever it might be, gives a certain power to the dividers. And obviously we are seeing that played out in this election year. And what we need is a more inclusive message that talks about why the family or the kid different from you actually is going to have a big impact on your productivity, on whether or not there is enough Social Security to pay you going forward, on whether or not there's a workforce that will care for you and care for your elderly parents. I mean, all of these very sensible kinds of demographic issues need to be much more highlighted. And think about how we don't have a birth rate replacement level right now. We are below replacement level, along with many of the countries that you named. So what do you do to have the workforce you need in an aging population? Well, some people say, well, you have to have more children. Well, you've got to make it worthwhile to have more children. You've got to make it supportive to have more children. You need paid family leave. You need good child care. You need universal health care. You need to take care of pregnant women. You go down the list. You want people to have more children, then you better make sure you take care of the people who are making that choice. And you also have to ask yourselves, well, how am I going to replace if we don't have a birth rate that keeps up, or it's a slow process? Well, you need immigration. Well, my gosh, if you need immigration, then guess what? You want to solve the problem, not keep it a problem. Political scientists will study what is going on in Washington right now for years to come. The Republicans have been saying, and I know this is nonpartisan, I'm just describing what's happening. The Republicans have been saying for years, we need more money, we need to fix the border, we need to do this, we need to do that. And now they have a Democratic White House and a Democratic Senate which say, okay, let's do it. Let's figure out what we're going to do, because we do have a problem. We're not going to ignore it. We're going to deal with it. Oh, wait a minute. that might mean we don't have an issue. And their presidential candidate is saying, don't solve the problem, don't solve the problem. It's the core of his entire appeal when you think about it. But don't solve the problem, because then I won't be able to run on the problem and keep people in a froth of anger, outrage, and fear if you solve the problem. So immigration has to be part of the solution if you're going to have a workforce to take care of people's needs in all of the care economy, which is woefully underfunded and woefully ignored by not just government, but by the private sector in terms of how to make it more effective. So I think, Nick, we know what to do. We have always known what to do. We need to elect people who will do it, and then hopefully support them in making decisions about what works. 10 years ago, the Clinton Foundation started a program called Too Small to Fail, because guess what? Brain development actually can be enhanced if you read, talk, and sing to your babies, your toddlers, your preschoolers. It actually builds, brain capacity. And so we went where kids were. We went to laundromats. We went to social service agencies. We built playgrounds. We've given away books. We have all kinds of, analyses from academics and others saying, guess what? It's working. Because you got families, you got caregivers, parents engaged to actually produce a positive outcome for kids. So some of our solutions are not that expensive. Some of them do cost money, but it should be viewed more as an investment. And if it's an investment in the future of children, it's an investment in us and our society and our own future as well.
Too Small to Fail is just a terrific program. I mean, the laundromats idea, I think, is particularly creative and smart. There are a couple of elements of it that strike me. One is that it's focused on that 0 to 3 space, and indeed, a majority, frankly, of public investment in childhood and a philanthropic investment has been in older ages. And secondly, that a lot of the Too Small to Fail work is really on local and states. And so I wondered if, there is a broader message for us that maybe Washington is so politically paralyzed for years to come that maybe we should be doing more of our advocacy at the state and local level, and that maybe we haven't pivoted enough to that early childhood space.
I think that's a really important question, and I do think we should do more at state and local level, and I think there's a lot of philanthropy represented in this room, investing in programs then taken to scale. I mean, you need to prove something can work, and oftentimes the best place to do that, like the Harlem Children's Zone, is in a local community where you bring, government, philanthropy, academia, activists, everybody together in order to make the case, and then to try to go further beyond where you have started to build a more sustainable, program. So yes, I think it would be, coming out of this conference, a really good idea to focus not only on the national level, although you should, and that's really important, but also on the state and local level to see if we can't get some good ideas. There's a lot of good programs that never then get taken to scale. And I often wish we would do a kind of inventory of everything that everybody knows works somewhere, and then figure out how we don't just keep reinventing the wheel. We take the wheel that works and we go as far as we can and create more programs that follow whatever the model is.
In your entirely nonpartisan remarks, you you emphasize the importance of accountability for politicians. That if we want better outcomes, we have to make them accountable. And I think within the child advocacy community, there's been a lot of optimism that, we have the message that voters care about kids. The first session this morning was about polling indicating that. And yet, there has been this difficulty translating that into electoral outcomes. And when I think of politicians who have actually successfully utilized, or I might say manipulated, that parental concern for kids, it has disproportionately, it seems to me, been people like Glenn Youngkin. or Ron DeSantis, who have taken the concern that the public has for children and advocated not for universal early childhood programs, but for very, very different kinds of interventions. So how is it that some people on one end of the political spectrum have managed to use or manipulate that concern, and what can we learn from what they're doing?
It's a really important question. Fear is a great motivator. And if you are told to be afraid of what's happening in your child's school library, and the only way to deal with it is by banning books, a lot of people will say, well, let's do that because at least then I don't have to worry about what my child's exposed to in the school library. And I think that there is a group of political leaders now who have taken that sort of fear-based approach. There's a lot of, I think, well-founded concern about how to raise children in what is a truly new and somewhat unprecedented environment, where it used to be your child would be influenced by not only people in your family, but, teachers or coaches or, neighbors, but it was a known universe. And now with social media, your children are being influenced by God knows who, from wherever. And there's a sense that parents are losing control. And when you fear losing control over the thing that is, most important to you, you might very well be susceptible to answers that are not exactly on point, but somebody's trying to do something to give you control back over a world in which you feel pretty much out of control. And I think that's one of the, insights that some political leaders have, that there's legitimate questions about what's going on in the world today, how we deal with it, and therefore preying on that in order to have an agenda that doesn't do very much to actually lift up and support families, but does, answer in a kind of visceral way those fears. So the alternative needs to get smarter about how to present a more positive view about what can be done to support families. We should do a much better job. And coming out of the pandemic, we saw a big increase in evictions because during the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure not to evict people who weren't going to work, weren't getting their full salary. What were they to do to pay? Then when, the lockdowns and COVID and everything began to dissipate and people began to be evicted, there should be a much greater outcry to help keep people in their homes. Don't make people homeless when we could work to help subsidize a solution that would be cheaper than actually, getting them evicted. I mean, common sense kinds of responses that should help support families in performing this very important function of parenting and make it more practical and responsive instead of fear-based, and then try to tell a story about what do families need to be successful in this new and somewhat challenging environment in which you are raising children. I mean, I have 3 grandchildren. I don't have any experience in what's going on in helping to raise children on social media. My daughter is very clear that limit screen time, try to supervise, but it's impossible. And how do you then, help deal with, what kids are seeing and learning, that you have no control over? So I do think people on the other side, not just politicians, but advocates, need to be honest about why there is a receptivity to these kinds of, quick and fear-based responses, and try to figure out how better to talk about a more positive agenda that would actually help families and kids.
At the same time that you've been a heroic advocate for children, you've also been a quite heroic advocate for gender equity in that same arc of time. And gender equity in that period has been largely about giving opportunities to girls. There has been some discussion in the last few years about the fact that boys' outcomes are, that many boys are particularly struggling, that suicide rates are higher, that overdose rates are higher, dropout rates are higher, et cetera, et cetera. In colleges now, the gender gap is greater in reverse than when Title IX was introduced. So how should we think about this? And we built up an architecture to support girls. Do we need to think about building up an architecture to support boys? How do we think about gender equity in this more complicated period?
And the answer is yes, we need to do that, Nick. And, you know, in 2019, I was in Norway for some events, and I met with some political leaders, some think tank people, and I was really surprised when they said that they were starting to see the same kind of social indicators, dropping out of school, not finishing college, not entering the formal workplace among boys and men in Norway. And we think about, you know, the Scandinavian countries, and you think, okay, you know, they have universal health care, universal education, access, all of that. So what's happening that would cause boys and men there to literally drop out of society? So this is not just an American problem. This is a global problem, and there was a recent survey that I recommend to all of you that was printed in the Financial Times a few days ago, where it says there's this huge gender gap between boys and girls, men and women, about the future, about what's worth doing. Is education worth pursuing? You know, a really very noticeable, remarkable gap between, you know, young men and young women in the world today. So I think this deserves a lot more attention than we are giving to it. I don't, by any means, have answers, but, you know, certainly some of the academics who are here, something is happening in the lives of boys and men that creates frustration, fatalism, anger, and I wrote a piece that was in the Atlantic magazine a few, months ago now, called The Weaponization of Loneliness. And it came out of the Surgeon General's excellent report about the increase in loneliness and the impact on our physical and mental health of loneliness. But I looked at it also from a sort of a political lens, because a lot of that loneliness is really concentrated in men, particularly young men, and it has been weaponized. And the best example I wrote about in the article was Steve Bannon, who realized when he was in the gaming industry that there were a lot of young men for whom gaming had become their lives. You know, more important than personal relations, more important than taking, risks or being held accountable in education or the workforce. And what he understood is that that loneliness could then be weaponized on behalf of political candidates. And you think about that insight, and it's pretty chilling, but accurate. So I don't know what's happening. I think it deserves a lot of study. You know, I was intrigued when I heard it is happening in other places, and now we know it's a global phenomenon, and so we do need to pay more attention to, what, boys and men are going through and how they are experiencing this sort of new world that we're all in, and what can be done to try to get them, in effect, reconnected, if possible.
Well, thank you for your remarks, and thank you for inspiring all of us for all these decades.